Christmas in Stockbridge. And this year, of course, we have to hold our events virtually or outdoors, asynchronously. So some of the things the library is hosting is a story walk through our garden. We have decorated trees with lights and ornaments throughout our garden that were generously donated by the Stockbridge Chamber of Commerce. And our most exciting offering for Christmas in Stockbridge this year is hosting Alison Larkin, who will read to us from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Alison is here at the library with me today. She will take this seat in just a few moments, but I would like to introduce her briefly. Alison is the best-selling author of The English American, which I can say is a lovely read or listen. She reads the audiobook, don't miss it. And she's the founder of Alison Larkin Presents, which is an award-winning audiobook company located right here in West Stockbridge. Alison has won 10 audiophile earphones awards, most recently for Jane Eyre and The Secret Garden. And impressively, Alison has narrated the 81-hour complete novels of Jane Austen, which is right now the best-selling audiobook in the world. And without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Alison and start our recording. Alison, it's all you.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born upon this day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. A Christmas Carol, Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything she chose to put her hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. She was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within her froze her old features, nipped her pointed nose, shriveled her cheek, stiffened her gait, made her eyes red, her thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in her grating voice. A frosty rime was on her head, and on her eyebrows, and her wiry chin. She carried her own low temperature always about with her. She iced her office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill her. 2 gentlemen arrive at the door. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to her. Have I the pleasure of addressing Miss Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Miss Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook her head and handed the credentials back. At this festive season of the year, mused Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up his pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, ma'am. Are there no prisons? Said Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then, said Scrooge. Both very busy, ma'am. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I am very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to remain anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. But if they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that, but you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a woman to understand her own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to a lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down to Scrooge's keyhole to regale her with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of, God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay, Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from her stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. You want all day tomorrow, I suppose, said Scrooge. If quite convenient, mum. It's not convenient, said Scrooge, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. The clerk smiled faintly. And Not yet, said Scrooge. You don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work? The clerk observed that it was only once a year. A poor excuse for picking a woman's pocket every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning her greatcoat to the chin. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. Scrooge took her melancholy dinner in her usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with her banker's book, went home to bed. She lived in chambers which had once belonged to her deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses and have forgotten the way out again. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during her whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about her as any woman in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderperson, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since her last mention of her 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then, let anyone explain to me, if they can, how it happened that Scrooge, having her key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath of hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid colour made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that she was not startled or that her blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy would be untrue. But she put her hand upon the key she had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted her candle. She did pause with a moment's irresolution before she shut the door. And she did look cautiously behind it first, as if she half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so she said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resonated through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a woman to be frightened by echoes. She fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming her candle as she went. Quite satisfied, she closed her door and locked herself in. Double locked herself in, which was not her custom. Thus secured against surprise, she took off her cravat, put on her dressing gown and slippers and her nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take her gruel. As she threw her head back in the chair, her glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as she looked, she saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door threw open with a booming sound, and then she heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards her door. "It's humbug," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." Her colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before her eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same, Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. The tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirt and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but she never believed it until now. No, nor did she believe it even now, though she looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before her, though she felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper she had not observed before. She was still incredulous and fought against her senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who are you then?" said Scrooge, raising her voice. "You're particular, for a shade." She was going to say "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because she didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef. A blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did she feel in her heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that she tried to be smart as a means of distracting her own attention and keeping down her terror. For the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of her bones. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a minute would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with her. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of his own. Scrooge could not feel it herself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from herself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry, and took and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to her chair to save herself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was her horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon her knees and clasped her hands before her face. "Mercy," she said. "Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me?" "Woman of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me?" "It is required of every person," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within them should walk abroad among their fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but it might have shared on earth and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about her on the floor in the expectation of finding herself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but she could see nothing. "Jacob," she said imploringly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge." "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge.
And we are all going to take a 30-second break. Thank you. Okay. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of people. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house, mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever she became thoughtful, to put her hands in her breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, she did so now, but without lifting up her eyes or getting off her knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed, in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow," the ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, "and travelling all the time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man at business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to herself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The source of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. Oh, at this time of the rolling year I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to the poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray." "How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from her brow. "That is no light part of my penance. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank you." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost,
by 3 spirits.
Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? She demanded in a faltering voice.
It is.
I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. She ventured to raise her eyes again and found her supernatural visitor confronting her in an erect attitude with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from her, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which she did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning her to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Scrooge followed to the window. Despite in her curiosity, she looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. She had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant with whom it saw below upon a store step. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, she could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together. And the night became as it was, and as it had been when she walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, and she had locked it with her own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. She tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the emotion she had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or her glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. You're all still, shall I carry on for a bit? I think you wanted 40 minutes. I'll carry on, you're all still there. Hello, everybody. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits, another 5 minutes. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, she could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of her chamber. She was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with her ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so she listened for the hour. Why, it isn't possible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon. The idea being an alarming one, she scrambled out of bed and groped her way to the window. All she could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there were no noises of people running to and fro. Scrooge went to bed again and thought and thought and thought it over and over and over. And the more she thought, the more perplexed she was. And the more she endeavoured not to think, the more she thought. Marley's ghost bothered her exceedingly. Every time she resolved within herself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, her mind flew back again, like a strong spirit released, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when she remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned her of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. She resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that she could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in her power. The quarter was so long that she was more than once convinced she must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke on her listening ear. Ding dong! 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong! 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong! 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong! The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. She spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did, with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of her bed were drawn. The curtains of her bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, not the curtains at her feet, nor the curtains at her back, but those to which her face was addressed. The curtains of her bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found herself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. As close to it as I am now to you, and as I am standing at the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old person, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave it the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered, now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me? Asked Scrooge. I am. The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside her, it were at a distance.
Who and what are you?
Demanded Scrooge. I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked her, but she had a special desire to see the spirit in its cap, and begged it to be covered. What? Exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out, with worldly hands, the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of its life. She then made bold to inquire what business brought it there. Your welfare, said the ghost.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you display. Remember Christ our Saviour was born upon this day to save us all from Satan's power, though we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy.
Bravo, Alison. That was such a wonderful delivery of a classic story. Thank you for joining us and reading with us. Before I open the floor to questions and answers, I just want to let our audience know that if they would like some more and would like to hear the rest of the story in your voice, your rendition, it is available on audiobook at Alison Larkin Presents, AlisonLarkinPresents.com, correct?
Yeah.
And I think you have the audiobook there. And Alison also generously donated a copy to the Stockbridge Library, so it will be here and available for you to check out. But if you are doing some holiday gift shopping at AlisonLarkinPresents.com, you can purchase audiobooks, this and many others, and Alison will be donating an audiobook to a visually impaired or a child with learning issues, specifically related to reading, for each audiobook purchased during the holiday season. And Alison, before we open the floor to questions, I have a question for you, and
Yes.
that is, what inspired you to make Scrooge a woman? How did you get this brilliant idea to adapt Dickens' tale in this way?
Well, I have two teenagers, and one of them said to me, Mom, what does it matter if you're gay or straight or a man wanting to be a woman or a woman wanting to be a man? And I said, well, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is love. And they said, well, why does everybody care? Why is it even an issue? And I said, well, that, my darling, is because we have lived in a patriarchal society for hundreds of years. And then I suddenly thought, well, would it be different if we hadn't? And then I thought, well, what if I was to take one of the most famous characters in English literature and change nothing but the gender of the protagonist? What kind of a world would we be in? I actually started with Great Expectations, and I did it just as an experiment. I had no idea that I was going to pursue it seriously, but as I read, especially with Pip to begin with, Pip in Great Expectations, this was as a girl was learning to read.
and a girl was having an opportunity at a career, and a girl was going to kiss and fall in love with a girl, and a girl could walk into a bar without being molested. And then I had to do Scrooge as well. I just had to. And so really it was just an experiment, really, because it's, nobody's blinking an eyelid about, oh my goodness, a woman having her own company and being very cranky and difficult, and then having a major transformation as she's visited by these ghosts. I mean, of course it wouldn't have happened in Dickens' London, but what if it had? And so I just thought, well, hopefully Dickens will forgive me, but he can't really say much about it because he's dead. So I decided I would do it. And as I did it and reading it, I have to say, I really fell in love with both books. I was very frightened by Great Expectations as a child and by Scrooge. And reading them, I just fell for the humanity, the humor and the humanity. And I forgot that Scrooge or Pip was a woman after maybe chapter 1. It didn't matter. So it was an interesting experiment. I'm actually curious to know if anybody listening today, what their thoughts were about it, if it bothered them, or if it didn't really matter.
Please feel free, audience, to unmute your microphones while people are putting their thoughts together about that. One more quick question. Have you been visited by a ghost since you started doing this rendition?
No, I haven't. No, sadly. No. But I have been perhaps I've thought a bit about what the ghosts are saying in my own life and what matters. And perhaps all of us, in a way, with this wretched pandemic, are in an unusual position to think about how we live our lives, what's considered to be important. And I haven't met anybody yet who hasn't said that how much they realize how important love is, and how important it is to connect with people and help them. And perhaps we've all been visited in a way by a ghost, sort of maybe reminding us about what's important and what isn't. I don't know. It depends on how you define ghost, I think.
Indeed. So I welcome the audience to chime in about your response.
I have a question. My question is about that introduction. When you referred to the best-selling audiobook in the world, is that Jane Austen? All of Jane Austen's novels?
Oh, that's lovely of you, Wendy, to say it was the best-selling audiobook in the world. It's the best-selling Jane Austen audiobook. Yes, it was the complete novels of Jane Austen, and I started with narrating Pride and Prejudice, and then I decided, let's not just do another rendition of Pride and Prejudice. Why don't I make it different? And so I also added songs from Regency England, as if we were in the Bennet's drawing room. And then I did Emma, and then I found myself recording Northanger Abbey and Persuasion with poems by Jane Austen, which she had written as a teenager. And then somebody said, why don't you do the complete novels? So it sort of took me, it was a four-year project, really, obviously with lots of gaps in the middle. And yes, I think it is the #1 best-selling Austen audiobook at the moment, touch wood. And so, yes, people, I think, I'm not sure whether it's a compliment, but a lot of people listen to it as they're going to sleep. And I think it's a good thing. But
I would take it as a compliment. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The last thing they'd like to hear is your voice. So as they're drifting off, you're there. I think it's a great compliment.
I've listened to all 81 hours of your Jane Austen, and I may say I've done it several times.
Oh, wow.
I would not be in the least surprised if it is not now, if it does not become the best-selling audiobook ever. It's simply magnificent.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much. I'm delighted that you enjoyed it, and I must say it was a great privilege to narrate. And so, thank you. After narrating it, I got to know the Austen family. I went to visit Chawton House, which is where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and I met a fourth great nephew, who was a man called Jeremy Knight, who actually was dyslexic, and he listened to Emma. He had never actually read the books because he was dyslexic, but he listened to my rendition of Emma, and now he's listened to all of them and introduced me to his daughter, Caroline Jane Knight, who wrote a memoir called Jane and Me, about being the last Austen descendant to grow up at Chawton House. And that was very exciting. So I narrated that, and she has the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, which helps refugees and others learn to read. And she and I believe Jane Austen's birthday, you'd have to go to AlisonLarkinPresents.com to check the date in a few days, but I think we're doing a tea to discuss Jane Austen. But that's a long way from Charles Dickens, of course, and it was before Charles Dickens. But it's interesting. One of the things that I love most about narrating the classics is that fashions change, technology moves on apace, but human nature remains the same. And we have in Stockbridge, and I don't know where many of you are around the country, but we all have characters like Ebenezer Scrooge. We have characters like Bob Cratchit. We know utterly selfish, greedy people who are only interested in themselves, or what we know of them. And people are the same. And so I think particularly at the moment, there's something wonderfully helpful about going back to the classics. The classics are classics for a reason. They're written by brilliant writers, and the humanity from each novel that I've had the privilege to read is just incredible. It comes out, and it's very exciting for me. What I'm trying to do, what I want to do, one of the things I want to do, apart from write another novel, is to bring the classics out to an American audience in a really accessible way, by reading them hopefully in a way that's really easy on the modern ear. And it's one of the reasons I've also hired others. We've just had Simon Jones, by the way. Did anybody see Downton Abbey? Well, the guy who played King George V in Downton Abbey, who also was the original Arthur Dent in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has just read Right Ho Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse for us, and also The Happy Prince and Other Stories by Oscar Wilde. Virginia McKenna, the great Virginia McKenna, who was in the movie Born Free, which many of you may have seen a long time ago, read some Rudyard Kipling for us, How the Elephant Got Its Trunk, and other wild animal stories. Tina Packer, who, as many of you, if you're from Stockbridge, heads Shakespeare and Company, is a superb actress, and she had written a book which is called Tales from Shakespeare. She took all of Shakespeare's plays and turned them into really accessible short stories. And I said, Tina, we've got to do this on audio. And she said, absolutely. And 5 days later, she had recorded it in my studio. So that's just coming out. We actually, I decided, wouldn't it be interesting to hire really fantastic Shakespearean actors to narrate the Gospels? So we've just done that, and we've got some very, very exciting things coming out next year, but we're working with some very exciting actors other than myself, because honestly, I don't want to have to do all the work. And that way I don't have to, and I get to hire these really wonderful voices. So we're trying to bring good things into the world. At the moment, there's not much we can do, but we can do something, and this is what I'm doing. And the other thing is just to talk a bit about what Wendy said. we are giving. So if any of you are want to purchase any of our audiobooks on AlisonLarkinPresents.com with one L in Alison, or you get a woman who does tapestry in Nebraska. If you go to the website and you buy an audiobook download, you can send them, by the way, as a gift to a friend. It's really easy. Then we will be giving a free audiobook to Calibre, who are distributing through a free library audiobooks for the print impaired all over the world. So the word print impaired means you can't see very well, or you may have some kind of concentration or learning disability, or you may be shut in somewhere and not be able to pick up a book because you don't have any arms or something. I don't know what it would be, but anyway, whatever reason it is, we are giving audiobooks. You are, if you buy an audiobook from our website between now and Christmas, which anybody would think I might stop talking eventually, but I will now.
There's actually a few questions, comments in the chat box from Michelle. She has a question about whether your Austen audiobooks are all unabridged.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Is that Michelle Joyner? Yeah, she's a wonderful actress. Yes, they are all unabridged. And so I have read every single word. Yeah, in fact, all our audiobooks are unabridged.
And then there's a nice compliment. It says, Alison, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Is that
it says,
my
I too
mom?
have been to Chawton and I'm so excited to check out your Austen audiobook.
Oh, that's wonderful. But we've got, the Austen audiobooks come in different shapes and sizes. There's either the complete novels, which you can get on Audible, or you can buy, I think, it's Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice with songs from Regency England, Northangarabrian Persuasion with poems and the history of England. And then actually at the end of Emma and Mansfield Park, oh, this is interesting. I put it together as a double bill. And I don't know how many of you are writers, but anybody here that's a writer will know that when you finish writing something, you always send it to your friends first, the people that you trust the most, and you hopefully will get some good feedback. Well, Jane Austen sent all her books off to her family and her friends, and she kept their responses, and some of them were not very complimentary.
Oh, no.
Emma was, well, it's not as good as P&P. And I really do think that Persuasion is your weakest novel so far, Jane. I think you should go back to doing what you were doing before. And so I read all of these, some of these responses, and we added them to the end of Emma and Mansfield Park, which sort of it's just interested me to add something else onto the classics to try and sort of, I don't know, just was interesting. That was it.
Indeed. There's one more comment in the chat box thanking you again so very much for you. And it says, your reading today begins our Christmas season. So you're really kicking off the holidays for many people. We're pretty much out of time. If there's one more question, we welcome it. Otherwise, I would like to thank you, Alison, so very much.
Thank you so much. This was great fun, and thank you. It was so lovely. I said to Wendy, could I come to the library and read it rather than doing it from my living room? Because you know how it is. We're all stuck at home all the time. And she didn't hesitate. She said, absolutely, you can. So it's been very nice to see another human being, and it's lovely to see all of you. And I just want to say, I suppose, one of the things after reading A Christmas Carol that perhaps I'll share with you and maybe will be helpful, perhaps, is it's a very good reminder about how very short life is and how much of a difference it's possible to make by maybe giving a shilling or two to the little boy singing God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, or stepping outside of our own loneliness and connecting with others at this time. And I think it's a story that's so utterly relevant, perhaps this Christmas more than ever. Anyway, happy Christmas, Merry Christmas to all of you.
Indeed. Thank you, Alison. Thank you all for joining us. And I genuinely want to thank our audience. It is because of our generous supporters that we're able to present free programming like this. So thank you for all of our audience and our supporters. And we hope to see you again in the library at other library events. Alison, thank you.
Thank you.